Hi, everyone. Welcome back to part 2 of this evolution presentation. So for this part of the presentation, we're going to be going over the different forms of evidence that scientists have collected to prove the theory of evolution. All right, so the first, there are the pictures. Oh, it's animated. Look what I did. So the first piece of evidence that we have to support the theory of evolution is the fossil record. And so if you don't know what a fossil is, it's basically when we dig up some bones or like an imprint on a rock or something of a skeleton or of an organism. And based off of what we see for that skeleton or that imprint of the organism, we can tell some features based off of that. And so the fossil record is a collection of fossils that show changes in organisms that can be observed over time. So why can't I move my face? What is this? Oh, mirror image. I guess I can't move my face. Oh, well. So the idea that it's showing you here in terms of fossils, these fossils or these skeletons match up with these diagrams over here. So this is the diagram of this right here. This is the fossil of this right here. This one matches with this one. This one matches with this one. And this matches with the modern day horse that we are familiar with. So what you can see by looking at the skeletons or the fossils of all of these different organisms, these organisms, these 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, they don't exist today. So we don't see them walking around the earth, but we have proof that at one point in time they did walk around the earth, and they have similarities to our modern day horse that we do see walking around the earth. And so basically we are able to show a change in characteristics. So here's our changes in characteristics within a population. So this is our like common ancestor to the horse population from generation to generation, because this change happened over many generations. So that's why the fossil record shows evidence to support the theory of evolution. All right, the next one. Do I have more pictures? I do. The next one, this is fun to talk about. It is called vestigial structures. So these are basically structures inside of organisms that are no longer used by that organism, but we still have them. So a great example of this, these pictures are real. Some humans are still born with tails. So remember, a tail is just an extension of the spine. You have extra vertebrae in your spine, and that's where we are getting these tails from these different humans. So as humans, we don't have tails, we don't use tails, but some of us still are born with tails, and that is showing an example of a vestigial structure. So quick pause question. If you did have a tail, such as this one right here, would you let it hang over your pants? Would you try to stuff it into your pants and hide it? Or would you cut a hole in your pants for it to hang out of? Just a thought question. But some other examples of vestigial structures in humans are the appendix, which is in your digestive system. It is used to digest things such as grass, but we don't eat grass anymore. And if we did, our appendix doesn't work. We still just have that organ inside of us. So that's another example of a vestigial organ. Another example we can look at, we can see inside of a whale. So whales, they have a pelvis or hip bones. That's what this is right here, and it zooms in. What you can see from this picture of the whale skeleton is that this pelvis is free floating. So it's not actually attached to any other pieces of the skeleton. And also the pelvis is used to help us walk around on our feet. So with like 4-legged animals like dogs and cats, their pelvis supports their hind legs. In humans, our pelvis supports us so that we can walk around on two legs and stand upright. Whales, they swim in the ocean, but what this is showing us is that they have an ancestor that used to walk on land because they have this pelvis structure inside of their skeleton, even though they don't need it and they don't use it. So it's showing a relationship between humans and whales, because remember, whales are mammals as well. But it's showing this vestigial structure. Whales have it, they don't use it, but it's showing that their ancestors probably used it when the whale walked on land, or the ancestor of the whale walked on land. We can also have homologous structures. Nope. Okay. We can also have homologous structures, and basically homo means same. So homologous structures are similar structures in different species of organisms. So if we look at like this diagram right here, or even these diagrams right here, because it's color coordinated, so it's a little bit easier to see. If we look at the bone structure in the arm of some different organisms, such as the human, the cat, the whale, and the bat, what you'll notice is that the organization of the skeleton is very, very similar. So we have the phalanges, which are your fingers down here in red. So we all have similar phalanges and the same number of phalanges. You then have like the metacarpals and the carpals, which would be the bones in your wrist right here. So we can see that in the bat, in the whale, in the cat, and in the human. After that, you have your radius and ulna, which are the two bones in your forearm. And so again, you see that in the bat, the whale, the cat, and the human. And finally, we all have a humerus bone, your funny bone, which is the bone in your upper arm up here. And again, you see it 1, 2, 3, and 4. So even though all of these structures look different in these different organisms, the bone structure is very, very similar. It's the same type of bone in the same format. There just might be some slightly different shapes. So another thing to point out, humans and cats, we walk around on land. Bats, they fly. They're still mammals, but they fly. They have wings. And then whales swim in the ocean. So they have like fins, but inside of their fin, their bone structure matches our bone structure. And again, this image over here is showing you the same thing. What it's also showing you is that bats should be more closely related to humans, lions, horses, frogs, and whales than a bird. So if you think about it, bats have wings, birds have wings, so you would think that they're closely related to each other. Bats are mammals. Their bone structure looks more similar to that of these other mammals over here. And then the bird wing structure, their bones look very, very different. So that's one way that we're able to tell that bats are more closely related to humans than they are to birds. All right, so next piece of evidence is embryology. So it's the study of embryos, which is basically unborn babies that are still inside the womb of the mother, or it could be inside of an egg, depending on the organism. So basically, we can use this to determine evolutionary relationships. And again, if we look at this diagram, we have all these different species. We have fish, salamander, tortoise, chicken, pig, cow, rabbit, and human. And if you look in the first trimester of development for embryos, we all look very, very similar, right? All of these look pretty much the same, maybe some slightly different shapes going on, but pretty much all of the same. As we come down to the second trimester, which is these pictures right here, you start to notice some differences, but still some organisms keep some similarities. So for example, the fish and the salamander still look very, very similar during the second trimester. The tortoise and the chicken look kind of similar for the second trimester. And then the pig, cow, rabbit, and human all look relatively similar for the second trimester. We can do the same thing looking at the third trimester down here. So again, we see that the fish and the salamander, they look similar. They still look different, but they look similar to each other compared to the others. We can see that the tortoise and even the chicken still look fairly similar to each other and different from the others. And then we can see that the pig, cow, rabbit, and human, they do look different from each other, but they look more similar to each other than the other 4 over here. So basically what we can tell from this diagram is that the fish and the salamander are probably more closely related to each other than they are to the other organisms. The tortoise and the chicken are more closely related to each other than compared to the other organisms. And then the pig, cow, rabbit, and human are more closely related to each other than they are to the other organisms. So again, we're just showing relationships, but there's this idea of proving evolution that, we all start out pretty much looking the same. And so our common ancestor for all of these different species had to have started out looking very similar as well. So that's again showing that there has been a change in characteristics within a population over generations because the common ancestor looks similar, and then there's been changes to those traits, and we can see those changes in the third trimester. All right, so we can also use DNA as evidence of evolution. And the idea here is that we can compare the actual genes themselves and also the order that the genes are in to look at evolutionary relationships and who's more closely related to whom. So here we are comparing the human, the chimpanzee, the gorilla, and the orangutan. So this is just a sequence of DNA, and every time you see an underline, that's where it's different compared to the human DNA. So this is for the gene, whatever this is, globin. I'm guessing it has to do with a red blood cell. But what you can see is that most of the time, the DNA sequence is identical. So we are very, very similar for this particular gene to these 3 other species over here, which means we have a very close relationship with them evolutionarily. You can go one step further, and when we look at the chromosome level, you will see a banding pattern in the chromosomes. So when I say banding pattern, I'm talking about this pattern of black and white spots along the chromosome. What this is showing us is that the DNA sequence is identical or very, very similar when we see the same banding pattern. So for example, with the human and the chimpanzee, this banding pattern that we see in these first genes right here, pretty much up until this point right here, it's identical, which means all of our genes and the sequence that our genes are in are identical to the chimpanzee. And again, you can compare things because we see this gene right here. So this banding sequence, the dark, light, dark, this is the same throughout the 4 species, which shows another similarity or close common ancestor between these 4 different species. So again, we're looking at this common ancestor that had these specific traits. These traits changed slightly between generations, gave rise to new species, which shows the theory of evolution. Another way we can do this, and I'm sorry that my face is blocking it, but I can't move my face right now, is we can also just compare how much of the DNA sequence is the same to other species. So if we take the human DNA sequence and we compare it to a chimp's, 98% of the time it will match exactly. It will be identical to the chimpanzee DNA. Mice will match our DNA 85% of the time. Zebrafish will match our DNA 85% of the time. This thale cress, it's a plant, matches our DNA 26% of the time. So not a huge relationship there, but we are related to plants, which shows a very long ago common ancestor to all species. Yeast, which is a protist, matches our DNA 23% of the time. The roundworm matches our DNA 21% of the time. And the common bacteria, E. coli or Escherichia coli. This bacteria actually lines your entire digestive tract from mouth to anus, and it matches our DNA 7% of the time. So looking at these relationships just in terms of percentages, obviously we are more closely related to these species up here, but it is still showing us that at one point in time, we had a common ancestor with things even as small and different from us as bacteria. So now that we have some evidence to help us support the theory of evolution, we can start talking about more of the details that come along with evolution and how evolution actually takes place. So that's what's going to happen in the next video. Pause here, make sure you are filling out your vocab notebook, and I will see you when we talk about natural selection.